I'd like to start also by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and to their elders past and present. And I'd like to thank you, Tony, for the enormous honour of inviting me this evening. I'm so pleased to be here among the Brotherhood family and friends, many of whom I've known and worked with for more decades than I care to say, and it's really great to see you all, and I'm looking forward to moving around later. Archbishop Philip Frere, Bruce Bonyhady, the chair of the board of the NDIS. The NDIS is undoubtedly one of the greatest social policy reforms Australia has ever seen, a once-in-a-generation reform alongside Medicare and national superannuation. In delivering the Sambell Oration this evening, I'm going to explore where we have come from to achieve this profound change and the journey it took to get here. This reflection, I hope, will make it possible to understand the genesis of the competing agendas as they still impact to this day on the NDIS. People become disabled from many causes, from accidents, be they road, sporting, working, playing, and going about day-to-day living, in a house, on a footpath, in a hospital. And people become disabled from being born. People become disabled from a wide range of illness, some acute, some chronic, some degenerative, some genetic. Disability can become a part of life or death from the earliest age and from then on at any age until old age, when 84% of people over 85 are disabled. So like being born, getting old and dying, disability is a part of life. Disability, like sickness, is universal, and like Medicare, the NDIS is universal. It's a universal scheme that covers every Australian under 65, no matter what the cause of their disability. And for those like me who are over 65 before the NDIS started, the aged care system takes over when I need it to. But for those of 13 months, the age I was when I became disabled, only 4% are disabled. I became disabled in 1949, just toddling enough to fly down the footpath into my dad's arms as soon as I heard the gate creak, signalling his return from work. I had only a couple of words at that age, and one of them was Daddy, a word I would shriek with excitement at the sound of him out the front. Polio was stalking our neighbourhood. A couple of other kids in the street were struck down with what then seemed as a precursor to the Grim Reaper. The image in my mind was of a skull-like figure haphazardly knocking down first the Hope children down the road and then some weeks later me. My mum talked endlessly about her feelings of helplessness, of her inability to keep me safe from the scourge that seemingly picked out its victims haphazardly from neighbourhoods all over Australia. My dad tells the story of going down to the end of the street to the telephone box to ring up the hospital to see if I was still alive, and the neighbour following him with Dettol and wiping down the telephone in case the infection spread to the next user. I can tell you from experience that the polio Grim Reaper predated HIV/AIDS. The polio epidemic was a shock to Australia in that it emerged in a policy vacuum. Up to this time, people with disabilities were dealt with privately, often shamefully hidden away as embarrassing secrets, or occasionally, as recounted by Alan Marshall in that great book, Still, I Can Jump Puddles, they lived good lives with homegrown resourcefulness, but there was no policy response. Policy for disability emerged firstly in healthcare after an uneven battle between the medical approach of keeping polio victims in rehab hospitals, for years rigidly splintered, all the crippled kids together, muscles wasting away, both the muscles of the body and the mind. Nurse Sister Elizabeth Kenny led the charge for the alternative, mobilising volunteers, massaging, keeping people with families at home, in the community, and even in the White House. Hunted out of Australia by the docks, Sister Kenny was lauded in the United States as she treated Franklin D. Roosevelt to stay as limber as possible. And most important for the history of the world, she treated him to stay in the world, standing for election and winning, not ruled by his body or by medicine or by segregation or by restriction. But in Australia, the medical model won the day, and from it, new models of disability care sprang up. Largely developed by parents, often in partnership with charitable groups, and strongly supported by doctors, institutions for cripples were established. These provided a cradle-to-grave place to live, go to school, to work, and to die. While mental institutions had existed since the late 19th century, the response to the polio epidemic heralded the emergence of places similar to asylums that would contain people with disabilities for their entire lives, away from shame and fear and from the dangers of the outside world. Not only did institutions provide a solution about what to do with the sudden flood of cripples, they were places where having a disability was the absolute focus. In institutions, disability was all-encompassing. Disability was the definition of identity. Because institutions looked after the disabled away from the world remained seriously and actively handicapping, with inaccessible and unwelcoming built environments and attitudes, including in schools, communities and workplaces. My own story is one of finally at age 3 being released back from a series of acute and rehab hospitals into the arms of my grieving family, grieving the loss of their bubbly little toddler, replaced in 1952 by a traumatised 3-year-old spread-eagled in a double Thomas splint. After my return home, Mum bravely fought very hard to keep me there, even though it was strongly recommended to her that I move from hospital straight to an institution so that my disability could be worked on. Mum adamantly refused. My mother was a teacher. She knew the liberating value of education, and while she wouldn't have articulated it as clearly, she understood that living in the community, including schooling to the maximum, would be a powerful tool in cutting through the shackles of my disability. Mum did, however, succumb to some of the pressure, allowing physios to visit me at home, and one of my earliest memories of that time was of flinging myself off the kitchen table and breaking my leg as the physio tried to stretch and exercise my body. I wanted to be off the table, away from the physio and out with the neighbourhood kids, because by then, with the tacit agreement of the family, I did not see myself as disabled at all, and my highest aspiration was to be part of the neighbourhood rabble. In my journey to understand the world of disability from parents' point of view, I now see that they copped it whatever they did. My mum was called aggressive and unrealistic, can't accept her child's disability was written on her file. In all cases, parents were trying to do their best. Racked by guilt and fear for the future of their children, some parents saw the world as hostile, dangerous and unfriendly, so sought to protect their children by putting them into what they saw as safe places closed to the outside world. A much smaller group of parents, like my mum, saw the world as hostile, dangerous and unfriendly, but believed that their children should adapt and adjust to it and tough it out. The institutions providing cradle-to-grave care soon took on lives of their own. While parents often remained on boards and as fundraisers, professional staff replaced volunteers, administrations developed, and a whole new disability segregated service sector started to emerge. The cycle of market supply needing a captive demand from children and adults with disabilities took off. An industry was born. Meanwhile, because of my mum's tenacity, I was playing out on the streets in then Housing Commission Hampton and at school as a witch in Macbeth in the drama club, and coming last in the school swimming sports, and knocking on the door but being rejected for the school basketball team, and also from the newly built athletics club down the road where I wanted to become a champion shot putter. In 1958, I left Brownies in a huff and tried to take up smoking after I was shunted off to the crippled Brownies during the visit from the Queen Mother, because my own local troupe didn't want me to spoil their presentation for the Queen Mum. This was my first experience of being a part of a segregated club, and I hated it. All of these experiences and many others contributed to the development of my passion for social, economic, educational and health rights, but fortunately my young smoking experiment did not take. I knew from a very young age about barriers, discrimination, being left out, being rejected, as well as being joyfully one of the crowd and aspiring like my mates to sing like Elvis Presley. I loved then being included because I was me, nothing to do with being disabled or not. However, while I invested a lot of me in pretending that I was a normal with very strong denial of my own disability, by the time I was a young woman, I consciously began to know. And the group that was responsible for me knowing was the Vietnam vets in the United States, the country of the birth of liberation rights movements, black, women, gay, civil rights, youth, and disability. And a few years later, these rights movements flowed down to Australia, and it was a very exciting time to be a young woman. I learned that in the USA, coming home from an unpopular war as adults who were being used to being part of society meant that the disabled Vietnam vets were refusing to accept the terrible treatment that people with disabilities had accepted as the norm until then. The vets joined forces with a group of polio activists led by Ed Roberts, and together they started the independent living movement. And I remember seeing Tom Cruise in Oliver Stone's Born on the 4th of July, a very strong film about the Vietnam vets demanding an equal life, refusing to be locked away in institutions. In Australia in the late 70s, a parallel movement began, although I was not part of its early days. Remember that I was at that stage strongly denying my disability and certainly not identifying as disabled. So I was fighting for the rights of many different groups, but not then people with disabilities. That is until I was profoundly challenged. It was the early 1980s and I was a rather arrogant young policy officer for a Council of Social Service, as Rob said. I was busy working on a housing policy for the disadvantaged that included people with disabilities. My workplace was down the road from our beloved brother organisation, the Brotherhood of St Laurence. Beloved because, among other things, it had incubated the residential tenancy union it was then known as, community childcare. The whole movement was started under the auspice of the Brotherhood, and the Ecumenical Migration Centre, and they're just three. There were many other areas. The phone rang and a slurred voice asked me what I thought I was doing. Writing a housing policy, I blithely responded. Who do you think you are, writing a policy for us without talking to us? I discovered that the owner of the slurred voice was Hal Fitzpatrick, and he had had a stroke, and that us was a feisty group of people with all kinds of disabilities, including some sadly not with us still. Jeff Bell, I'm just going to mention these because they're sort of our elders. Jeff Bell, Roger Melnick, Rob McNamara, Fiona Smith, Vicky Aitken, Leslie Hall, Trish Maloney, who's here, Eddie Ryan, John Pulicino, and that's just a few. They were from my earliest memories of the members of the disability rights movement in Victoria, trying to fight for rights and reforms similar to the USA. There, however, the Bill of Rights provided the context for the development for the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, a world-leading piece of legislation that prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability and provided for civil rights. Interestingly, this American legislation was enacted after a civil rights demonstration, a sit-in by people with disabilities that lasted for 28 days at the office of the USA Department of Health, Education and Welfare. Because we didn't have the legislative springboard of a Bill of Rights, and perhaps back then because we didn't have the appetite to sit in anywhere for a month, in Australia we were slower and ultimately less successful than the USA, Canada, Sweden, Netherlands, Germany and the UK in forcing mainstream systems such as health, education, transport and buildings to include people with disabilities. But we were successful in fighting to close institutions. We saw the very institutions that my mum had saved me from as the symbol of all that was wrong with disability. Locked away from society, out of sight, out of mind, deinstitutionalisation became our main aim, and we certainly were responsible for reducing the number of institutions in Australia. We celebrated as a major win the replacement for institutions with community residential units or group homes. Because they only had 6 to 8 residents, we thought this was a vast improvement on 300 or even 60. One of my first tasks in 1983 as CEO of the Myer Foundation and Sydney Myer Fund was to oversee a grant for the first group home in Australia, Black and Carrillo Gantner, for their daughter Cassie. It was seen as revolutionary to have a homely place for Cassie with a small group of other disabled people. So it was very dismaying to realise several years later, by the late 80s, that group homes can also fast become institutional, providing no tenancy rights or choice over who you live with or how you spend your day or what you eat, and for most residents seeing no non-disabled people except paid workers. Many of us, however, turned our attention away from these closed, segregated service models to concentrate on mainstream inclusion, and the 80s saw the introduction of integrated education. The 90s saw the beginnings of accessible transport and accessible government buildings, and there were flurries around inclusive playgroups and childcare, but basically getting governments to mandate moving towards inclusion in the mainstream was piecemeal and painful. 1 step forward and 2 back, or that's what it felt like. For example, special schools kept making a resurgence, even though all of the evidence, even at that stage, showed that mainstream education brings superior learning outcomes for disabled children. Meanwhile, while we were working hard trying to force the mainstream world to include people with disabilities, the specialist service sector flew under the radar, and it was expanding, but not enough. Many people were unable to get any services at all, neither specialised nor mainstream. And where they were finally allocated a service, it was for 1 or 2 showers a week, not enough to enable them to lead a life in the world. Or it was more likely that they would be allocated a place in a segregated service, grouped together with their own kind, where there was a vacant bed or a vacant place in an adult day program or a place in a sheltered workshop. There was certainly no choice and no control, and no chance of being a citizen in the world alongside everyone else. The situation was desperate, and families felt a huge impact. Either they did or no one did, and many families simply could not keep going. In the 90s, families came together to form the carer movement, and the carers started to campaign strongly and loudly. They largely saw disability from a burden perspective, and this characterisation was understandable because that was the actual experience of many families. But it alienated the networks of people with disabilities fighting for rights. During the second half of the 90s and into the 21st century, people with disabilities saw the carer movement become well-funded and influential, while the fight for disability rights seriously faltered, partly because of lack of funding, which reinforced lack of influence. And while at that stage carers and people with disabilities groups were at war with each other over the issue of burden versus rights, services were relatively unchallenged, and so were their models of care. However, the growing clamour from carers in fact bore fruit. The idea for an NDIS had been around since 1975, accepted just too late by the Whitlam government, and in its last days, the Woodhouse report recommended a no-fault disability insurance scheme for all disabilities. But in 2008, it was largely in response to carer concern and pressure for something to be provided for their loved ones that the new impetus for the NDIS emerged. So once the idea for the NDIS was floated, and there were three vitally interested parties: carers, people with disabilities and service providers, all with different expectations of the NDIS. Carers saw an NDIS as bringing much needed relief, and many still saw relief as safe, all-encompassing specialist disability services, similar in many ways to those created by parents in the 50s. However, similar to the 50s, a small group, often of younger families, argued that they wanted an NDIS to support their loved ones to become part of the community. Represented by organisations such as Down Syndrome Associations, Children with Disability Australia, this group of carers, who usually preferred to be called families, joined up with people with disabilities groups to strongly propose that the purpose of the NDIS should be to provide support for inclusion in the mainstream world, for human rights and citizenship. They were highly critical of segregated services. And while people with disabilities groups were far weaker financially, organisationally and politically, they still punched above their weight in their influence on the design of the NDIS. And the service sector saw the NDIS as leading to a major expansion for their specialist disability services. But even with these different hopes and expectations for the NDIS, we did somehow manage to build an alliance between the three parts of the disability sector. And this alliance, where everyone worked together for the NDIS, became strong enough to fuel the successful campaign, the Every Australian Counts campaign, leading to a massive community mobilisation, which in turn led to almost unheard of bipartisan support for the 2013 NDIS Act. However, looking back on the alliance, it really is a miracle that it came together, considering the very different interests about what the NDIS should be about. In early 2008, I initiated the first meeting leading to the formation of the Alliance in my North Melbourne office, and it turned out to be a very moving meeting for all of us. Carers and people with disabilities networks really heard how it was from each other's point of view. People with disabilities were able to hear about how families did feel intolerably burdened. And I can remember Leslie Hall at that meeting really acknowledging that. And carers were able to hear how much that term burden hurt people and also damaged the fight for rights. The burden discourse began to abate, although I do have to admit that without it, we might not have won the hearts and minds of the community and the politicians, and that's worth thinking about in itself. However, the tension implicit in these different views of people with disabilities as people to be cared for, or as people where supports can mean that they can care for themselves, this tension is crucial to understand and keep in mind, as it is still being played out in the rollout of the NDIS, and has a huge impact on the potential for long-term benefits from the NDIS. Apart from facilitating the building of the Alliance, my second main role in the early development of the NDIS was as chair of the largest government council in Australia I had ever seen, much less chaired, and it had the longest name ever too. 28 members strong, the National People with Disability and Carer Council, the NPDCC, advised the government on all things to do with disability, including intensely the NDIS as it emerged. The council's membership reflected the alliance, people with disabilities, carers and services, with the addition of a couple of trade union and business leaders. And together we nutted over many issues that are still central to the NDIS. The issues negotiated by the NPDCC focused on how to make Australia accessible and inclusive. It produced the report Shut Out that analysed the barriers and developed a blueprint for people with disabilities to be able to become true dinks part of Australian society. The result of the Shut Out report was the National Disability Strategy, and the Council saw the NDIS with its packages for individuals as an important part of the puzzle, but it was only ever seen as part of that puzzle. The Council never believed that an individual family with an NDIS package would be able to force local schools to welcome their child. This was to be taken up by the National Disability Strategy with practical recommendations for federal and state governments about how, over a period of time, all mainstream schools would become inclusive of children with disability. The Council never believed that the NDIS would be able to force employers to stop discriminating, to stop employers believing that people with a disability do not have the capacity to contribute to their workplaces and all they are fit for is a sheltered workshop. Expelling this myth was the responsibility of the National Disability Strategy, with a whole fistful of recommendations for federal, state and local governments to urgently improve their own employment inclusion rates, as well as to provide incentives and sanctions to non-government organisations and businesses. The Council never thought that the NDIS would make public transport systems hurry up to become fully accessible, or would make governments enact a minimum regulation for building codes similar to other developed countries. These were part of the National Disability Strategy with strong recommendations. And the Council of Australian Governments accepted the National Disability Strategy as a COAG strategy in 2012 to reform all systems to ensure the inclusion of people with disabilities. We saw this as a huge victory, believing that the National Disability Strategy would in itself reduce the impact of people's disability. Within this context, the NDIS was then seen as providing the person with an individual package to give them what would be needed to bridge the gap between a disabled life and an ordinary life. It was never envisaged that these individual packages provided by the NDIS would be given in a vacuum of an inaccessible, non-inclusive Australia. The fact that the National Disability Strategy has dropped off the radar has serious implications for the NDIS. It has loaded up the NDIS with either inadvertently taking the impossible responsibility for ensuring that all systems become accessible and inclusive. This is impossible because the NDIS does not have the authority or the resources. And what is more likely by default is that the NDIS is pushed towards the solution to a non-inclusive outside world, and that is to oversee the vast expansion of closed segregated services. In fact, the impetus to expand specialist disability services is strong. This is what governments naturally focus on because they are concerned that there will not be enough group home accommodation, day program places, sheltered employment places, respite beds and personal support workers. As Gertrude Stein might have said, supply is supply is supply. New choices about living, learning, playing and working in the mainstream world, however, require a very different view of the supply needed for the NDIS. For these new choices to become possible, Innovative models have to be encouraged that enable people to form their own relationships, be able to leave old service models and choose to play, work and live in the community with drop-in support or with mates of their own choice. These choices are very different to those provided by specialist support services that relate most closely to the models from the 50s, and just like in the 50s, have provided families with the fantasy of a risk-free, fully safe environment. Choice and control is central to the NDIS. It means for the first time, people with disabilities can be in the driver's seat of their own lives. But in order for choice and control to become more than a mantra, people need a vision and aspiration for what is possible, and then they need encouragement and support to fulfil the aspiration. This is the demand side of the market, which has to date been largely ignored. Even basic economics says that if only supply is emphasised and consumers are weak, then the market will not provide dynamism, innovation and progress. On the other hand, an NDIS that supports people to become more independent, more included in the community and more self-managing also contributes to the sustainability of the scheme. This makes for an absolutely exquisite synergy where the right to live ordinary lives becomes absolutely fundamental as an insurance principle for the scheme. But people who've had years of disenfranchisement and isolation have a learned helplessness. They need help to strengthen their competence and confidence to move from being dependent clients to becoming active citizens. It is therefore vital for the NDIS to have strong and sophisticated demand for new types of supply, for services that help people lead ordinary lives in their communities. But how do we build this strong demand for something different? People don't change their vision of what is possible overnight. One systematic answer is to leverage off people with disability and family peer support groups. These are groups where people share information, strategies and ideas to try approaches that lead towards an ordinary life. These groups are made up of people who have personal lived experience and are struggling with the same issues and are experimenting with new approaches. These are the groups where members give each other courage and support to have a go. They have unique knowledge that is vitally important about what works and what doesn't, and how individuals and families can dare to try new ways. These are the groups that could be brought into an Australia-wide network to support market demand for innovation. Because of the urgent need to stimulate market demand for new types of supports, I've been strongly supportive of the Productivity Commission's recommendation, the need for a comprehensive network of peer support groups to become disability support organisations. Face-to-face, online, diagnostic, population, special concern, geographically easy to reach groups, groups for all issues and needs for families and people with disabilities. But it is important not to be romantic about the capacity of these groups, considering that they must become strong enough to build innovative demand and at the same time to effectively argue that every sector and system needs to become inclusive. This is a big ask of groups that have been relegated to the outer circle of influence, even though it could be argued that they ought to be central, not only to the NDIS, but also to the reinvigoration and relaunching of the National Disability Strategy. Remember, these are the same groups that exist on the smell of an oily rag, where they punched miles above their weight in the early campaign for the NDIS. Perhaps the huge contribution in those early years left a false impression that they were strong enough to continue to exist without resources and at the same time to make the important contribution to the development of the demand side of the market. A top priority is therefore the building of the capacity of peer support organisations at local community level as well as state and national, and all functions need strengthening: financial, governance, organisational and policy. And because I'm delivering this oration here tonight, it is too difficult to resist the temptation to suggest that the Brotherhood of St Laurence might play a very important role in strengthening the people with disabilities side of the equation. I referred earlier to the Brotherhood's proud history in supporting and incubating consumer-based organisations, and it would be such an excellent contribution by the Brotherhood for you to consider ways to contribute to strengthening what I call absolutely vital gems, peer support groups. So while logistics, IT and numbers are the painful and extremely important reality of day-to-day challenges for now, and no doubt over the next 3 transition years at least, at the same time there are other critical issues. And these have their genesis in the history of disability policy from the 1950s to the different hopes and dreams leading up to the NDIS. The NDIS captured the imagination of every stakeholder in the disability sector, of families, of people with disabilities and of services. Everyone was united in campaigning for every Australian to count. Yet at the heart of the campaign was always an unresolved issue. From the late 40s when I became disabled to the present day, there has been a struggle over people with disabilities. Do they belong in the world or not? The 50s approach that is still alive today is where people with disabilities are still out of sight and out of mind, away from the world, leading lives dominated by disability. Living but not living. The 50s also saw the beginnings of the alternative that benefited me, the struggle to ensure that people with disabilities fully participate in their society. This approach has now become predominant in most developed countries and is also reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. The alternative of treating people with disabilities as best kept with their own kind away from the world also allows the wider society to not face their own frailties, including the inevitability of disability and death. But the outcome of this struggle must be that the NDIS supports people to live their lives as citizens, enabled to become playmates, schoolmates, workmates, out there everywhere with their mates. This must become what it is to be disabled in Australia in the 21st century. Thank you.